slide. So now we're going to analyze test crosses, recombination, and go over pedigrees because I think these are essential to understanding some of the questions that they may show on the MCAT. So the types of crosses and the types of generations that they might say in the actual questions are, so as I referred to earlier, a monohybrid cross is when there are two heterozygotes crossing for the same, like the same trait. So in this case, you have like the whole A allele has, one side, which is the dominant uppercase A, and the recessive, the lowercase a. And whenever it has like whenever it has hybrid, that's always like with a heterozygous trait. And so you have the big A, little a, crossing with another big A, little a. Now for a dihybrid cross, that's when for two traits, so two traits, they're both heterozygous. So here we have A and B being two different traits, and we have a big A, little a, and big B, little b, crossing with a big A, little a, and big B, little b. And then for test crosses, so this may be mentioned a lot in questions, is when you have one organism for a certain trait crossed with the recessive version of that trait. And the main reason they do test crosses is really to determine the actual genotype of the original organism. So sometimes, the phenotype may not necessarily express like the full genotype, in the sense that if it's a heterozygote, you're only going to be seeing the dominant trait and not the recessive. So like if you have two big A's here, let's say, and you cross it with the recessive alleles, then all of the offspring should show that big A trait. But in the situation where you have a heterozygote, so a big A, little a, and you cross it with the two little a's, then you're going to see a mixture of both like the dominant A and the little a's. So that's how usually researchers determine like what that original organism's traits are like, especially if they don't have any information about that. And parental generations, also known as P generation, it's the pure breeding of organisms in their given traits. So like in the example with Mendel's peas and how they produce, different flowers, pure breeding. So that means every time these parents are crossing, they're producing exactly the same thing every time. And pure as in both would be like both of the alleles would be homozygous in that case. So like for the purple flowers, all of them would have two uppercase P's, and for all of the white flowers, both would have two lowercase P's. And then from the parental generation, we get to the first filial generation, or the F1 generation, which is the generation after the first cross when parents produce their first offspring. So this F1 generation is a result of the parental generation. And then we also have a second filial F2 generation, which is the generation after that F1 generation crosses with each other, and when the F1 generation produces their offspring. So we kind of, F1 are all the offspring from the P generation, and F2 are all of the offspring from the F1 generation when, each of these respective generations mate with each other. And also, I decided to create this table, which is proportions to know. So on the MCAT, when they give you like genetics questions and they're talking about monohybrid crosses, or I guess I would say, because it could be monohybrid, dihybrid, trihybrid, it keeps going on, right? So they can change that first part of the word of the monohybrid portion, and that would determine how many different traits that you're thinking of. But a lot of times for a question, they'll mention like certain traits, whether it's dominant or recessive, and they usually some questions ask about like what proportion of the offspring in the different generations might display a trait. And so I figure this is a good like table of things to know, especially it's like so that you have like a quick ratio that comes to your mind when you're doing these type of questions because you want to get through all of the questions really quickly on the exam. So for the first column is cross type and details. And so we have a monohybrid cross here and we're assuming complete dominance. And so here you would see the genotypic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1. And it would have these 3 different genotypes. And then for the phenotypic ratio, you would have a 3 to 1 ratio in which 3 of the offspring are expressing that big A phenotype, and then 1 would be expressing that little a phenotype. So then here we have a heterozygous dominant and recessive cross with also assuming complete dominance. So we have here a heterozygote crossed with a homozygote for the recessive trait. And you have this genotypic ratio of 1 to 1 because, you know, when you do a cross with this, you would have half with that big A little a, and then another half with the little a. And then the phenotypic ratio is actually similar. It's the same, showing half with the big A trait and half with the little a trait. Following this is the monohybrid cross, assuming incomplete dominance. And so here you have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, which is actually similar to like the genotype of a monohybrid cross with complete dominance. It's just that for the phenotypic ratio itself, it shows a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio because it shows that incomplete dominant phenotype. And then for the dihybrid cross, assuming complete dominance, this is like big A, big B, little b, crossed with the same genotype. I will say for the most part that you will not need to memorize like this particular proportion. I just wanted to break it down so you guys could, if you wanted to count it, you could see how this phenotypic ratio occurs. So probably I'm not going to go through this exactly unless you have more questions about it. But so for the phenotypic ratio for a dihybrid cross, a really good thing to know is the 9 to 3 to 3 to 1 ratio, where 9 would show both of the dominant phenotypes, 3 would show the dominant phenotype of one of the traits and the recessive phenotype of the other trait, and then another 3 would do the reverse of that, and then 1 would have the both recessive alleles. And then finally for this cross type heterozygous dominant for 2 genes and a recessive cross assuming complete dominance. So we have the big A, big B, little b times crossing with the recessive of the entire thing. And so here we have a 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. And also in the phenotype, you would see the 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. So this is good to know. And then also what I found to be helpful when kind of dissecting the questions was to determine between like and or. So and usually when they say you know, probability, or I'm just going to go. So, and when there are independent events. So for the example of like the big, for the dihybrid cross here, we are looking for a probability of getting the A and the B phenotype, right? And so here we would have 3/4 times 3/4 equals to 9 out of 16 getting the AB phenotype. And this is based on the proportions that we kind of just went over before. So as you know, when you have like a monohybrid cross, you have that 3 to 1 ratio of 3 of them showing the dominant trait and 1 of them showing the recessive trait. So if we're looking for both the A dominant trait and the B dominant trait, we're doing the 3 out of 4 times 3 out of 4 to get that full total of how you're getting the probability of getting this particular phenotype. So this and that. And that's why you would multiply here. And then for or, it's when there are mutually exclusive events. So they would say, so for the example again of a dihybrid cross, if they say the probability of getting the heterozygous form of the A trait and the B trait, or the homozygous dominant form of the A and the B trait genotype, then you would have to, so because of this or, we would know that we have to add the probability of getting this and getting this. So, I mean, this or getting that, and so that's why you would add it. And so for the first part, we're trying to find the big A, little a genotype from this original heterozygote A trait. And so if you remember from the original proportions that I had, you would have two, so if you would have 3 to 1 in terms of phenotype, but it would be 1 to 2 to 1 for genotype. And so then it would be 2 out of 4 for getting the heterozygote, which can then be simplified to 1 out of 2. And then you would do the same thing, multiplying it by the 1 out of 2 here to get this. It would be a 1 out of 4 value here. And then for here, you have the big A, little big B. So then in order to get that from this cross, it would be 1/4 times 1/4. Hopefully you guys get the idea of how that works. And then you would add the two values of the probability of getting both from this original cross. And so, yeah, this is just kind of a diagram of how usually alleles separate. So you have that if the original one had a big B, little b, then you have like a column that it's multiplying big B with big B, and then big B with a little b. So that's how each of those crosses look like visually. And then I also wanted to talk about pedigrees and distinguishing between modes of inheritance, because sometimes they'll give also a question in which they kind of just show a pedigree and they expect you guys to be able to answer, if it's autosomal dominant, autosomal recessive, sex linked, those type of answers. So just to go over what a pedigree is, a pedigree is a genetic representation of a family tree that diagrams the inheritance of a trait or disease through several generations. And it's basically like a family tree. Yeah. And when you're looking at these pedigrees, you're analyzing really the effects or the phenotypes that you see. And usually you can derive the genotypes by how, if you're, noting how each of the phenotypes should show up based on like the information that they give you in the question. So I broke it first into autosomal dominant or recessive versus like the sex-linked inheritance. And so for autosomal, you would determine, or you would, when you're analyzing the pedigree, you would see that both males and females are equally likely to be affected. But specifically for autosomal dominant traits, usually at least one parent must show the trait, and the trait will not skip a generation because that dominant phenotype would be showing through each of the generations. And I would say most of the offspring, if not all. And then for the autosomal recessive inheritance, so in this case, this trait may skip a generation and both parents do not have to display the trait. So, how sometimes you would have like two, it could be a family member who is like homozygote of the dominant trait and then heterozygote of the same trait. And so then if you do that cross, like all of their offspring will have, that dominant trait. But then if you have a heterozygote offspring from that cross, crossing with like another heterozygote of some sort, then you would suddenly see, like, there's a 1/4 chance that that trait may come up, but you might see that recessive trait suddenly come up from the two parents not seemingly being originally affected. So then the other category is sex-linked traits, in which males and females may have different chances to be affected by the trait. So one of these is X-linked dominant trait. And so, as I mentioned earlier, so females have 2 X chromosomes and males have 1 X chromosome. And so here, all female offspring, so one tip is that all female offspring from an affected father will display the trait, right? Because from a father and a mother, the all female offspring have 1 X chromosome from their father and 1 X chromosome from their mother. So if the child has an affected father and the trait is X-linked dominant, then you know that that specific X chromosome that she is getting from her father is that dominant one, and no matter what X chromosome she gets from her mother, she will display that trait that her father has if he expresses it. And then next is X-linked recessive, which in that case, more males tend to display the trait from an affected mother because males only have 1 X chromosome. So if they're receiving that X-linked recessive trait from an affected mother, they're definitely going to show it. While for females, it's a little different because they can have the X-linked recessive trait from their mother, but if they get like an X-linked dominant trait from their father, then if they get another trait from their father that's like normal and that is dominant to that recessive trait, then they won't show that recessive trait. And then there is also the chance of Y-linked, in which case all male offspring from an affected father will display the trait. So anyone with that Y chromosome will express it. And then also mitochondrial, in which all offspring from a mother with the trait are affected. So the interesting thing about mitochondrial DNA, it all comes from your mother. So if you have an affected mother and this trait is from the mitochondrial DNA, then all of her children would have this particular trait. So now I wanted to go into some questions based on what we just learned. So let me resume. Well, actually, so first we have 67% saying A and 33% saying C. So I'm just going to resume share here. So while you guys are doing the question, I also kind of did it here. And oh wait, sorry. The answer should, wait, hold on. The answer is, oops here. The answer here was C based on my original calculation. I think I must have did a minor thing here, which was, so, well, first for the question itself, right? We are trying to determine so the question says, in a flower, purple is dominant to white, in which case purple is the big A here and white is the little a. And tall B is tall, which is big B, is dominant to short, which is little b. And so first we know that we have a heterozygous purple and tall plant that is crossed with a white and short flower. So we're looking at what is the chance that the offspring will be tall and have white flowers. So first we want to figure out the original genotypes of the original parent plants. So we have a heterozygous purple and tall plant. So that's why you have big A little a and big B little b crossed with a white and short flower. And so we know that white is recessive, so you need 2 of them to be shown. And short is also recessive, so you need 2 of them to be shown. And we're asking, what is the chance that the offspring will be tall and have white flowers? So in order to be tall, you can just have like big B with something else. Like it could be either big B or big B little b. And having white flowers, which in this case, you know that having white flowers has to be little a, little a. And so when you cross these two, so when you cross the big A little a with the little a, there is a 1-to-1 ratio, which I showed in that proportions chart. And so that's why you get 1/2 chance of first getting this this little a. And then the next part we want to determine is what is the chance that you would have tall. So from this, actually, because there is no another big B somewhere else, you would do the big B times the little b, and actually it would be like the same cross as before. So then you would have that 1/2. And then that's how you get that 1/4. Apologies for that earlier mistake. It was because it wasn't a monohybrid cross, but it was actually a heterozygous crossed with the recessive. So that's how you get to that final answer of 1/4. Okay. In this case, we have 33% saying A, 33% saying C, and 33% saying D. So this is a little bit interesting. The answer is actually B, and I will go over why this is the case. So as I mentioned, sometimes on the MCAT, you will get a pedigree shown to you, and it will ask, what mode of inheritance is this condition? So we can see here first that you have a father that's affected and a mother that is not. And then you go here and you see that one of the children are affected, while 3 of them are normal, right? So first of all, one thing that we can cross out now is Y length. The reason why is because if the father had it on the Y chromosome, then he would not only give this trait to his son, his one son here on the left side, but also would give it to the one son on this right side in between the 2 daughters. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit just to debrief on like how to read a pedigree. So here you'll see usually squares represent males and circles represent females. And so this line in between them usually means that those two are mated, or like they crossed in order to produce like these next offsprings. So all of the ones coming from this joined center line here are all their children. And then all of these, like, so this square here and this circle here on the left and the right are both like unrelated individuals that also mated with this child to produce like this other offspring. Okay, so we just went over first why Y length is incorrect, because then this son would also have that trait. So then we go into here where we're trying to determine, okay, so could it be X length? So you have X length, but specifically here, X length dominant, right? So we have, in that case, it would be like an X dominant, and let's see, yes, okay. So you would have an X dominant, and a Y. But if the, wife is not showing it, she has 2 X chromosomes, in which case then these must be recessive because she's not showing the trait. So big A and little a. And so if they have a daughter, then this daughter would also have to show the trait if it was an X-linked dominant trait, because you would have the X, the big A, and then the X with the little a. So that's why for C, we can cross that one out as well. And then Oh, sorry. Oh, you guys, okay. Sorry about that. Um, so, okay, what I was referring to, so thank you for letting me know. Sorry about that. Um, but yeah, so I was saying here, this is what I was saying. So for if it was X-linked dominant, then you would have a X with a dominant A from this male because, males only have one X chromosome. And then if it's an X-linked dominant trait, then that means the female, the wife, must have a X with the recessive traits. And so if they were to give birth to a child, the child and the child is a female, the child would have to get, one X chromosome from the father and one from the mother. In which case this she would be receiving a X-linked dominant trait, and so she would actually have to show that trait as well, if it was an X-linked dominant trait. And so that's why C is incorrect. And since you guys couldn't see my screen before, yeah, so these lines represent mating. If it goes down from here, these are offspring, and anyone coming outside of this tree are just like outside people that are mating with the child to produce more children. The reason why it wasn't Y-linked was because this son here doesn't have the trait that the father would have, because the Y is always inherited. Well, the son's Y chromosome is always inherited from their father. Okay. And then in terms of autosomal dominant, so autosomal dominant versus autosomal recessive. So kind of like what I mentioned earlier is if, this was an autosomal dominant trait, so the person could be, I put a line here, it could be big A, or big A, little a. And in that case, then this wife would have to be little a, little a. And so, there could be the chance that there is, I mean, technically the proportions is half-half, but there is a chance, so it's half-half for each of them. I mean, half of getting the dominant and half of getting the recessive. So, I mean, it's completely possible based on like how the proportions go that only this one son gets it and the 3 other children don't. But here's the thing, is that suddenly there's this trait that pops up out of nowhere, right? Because if it was an autosomal dominant trait, then that means that this child should have gotten that autosomal dominant allele, I mean that dominant allele from either the mom or the father, in which case both of them don't have it, so then it couldn't be an autosomal dominant trait. And then finally, why it's autosomal recessive is so we eliminated all 3 other ones. So autosomal recessive, if in this case, this parent is 2 recessive, and so this mom can either be, heterozygote or homozygote for that dominant trait. I mean, the dominant normal, because this trait is recessive, autosomal recessive. And so here, right, this child could come up because in the event that this mother had this heterozygote trait for that allele. And so if you have like, 2 recessives here, again, the mom for this child could be both. And so there is a possibility that this normal child could arise. Also, it is completely possible that normal children could arise from this cross. So that's why these are fine. And then in the event that, this is a normal child coming from this cross, that normal child is going to have to be a heterozygote because you are getting, and because this child is normal. So that means that somehow she's getting a dominant trait from the mom because the mom is normal. And then the other allele has to be a little a allele for that recessive trait. And then once you mate, you suddenly see that there is this kid who has this recessive trait. So in that case, if the father is normal, then we would know that in order to have this child have this recessive trait, um, the father would probably also have to have this recessive allele in order to create this recessive trait.